Are you going through any hardship in your life? During those hardships, maybe you've wondered, as I think so many people have wondered. In fact, it's like the most natural, understandable question, and that is, where are you, God, in the midst of my struggle? It can be especially difficult when the pain or the hardship that we've been experiencing, whether it's relational or emotional, it could be definitely physical. When that pain is lingering and there seems to be no end in sight, we wonder where God is. Does he even care? Well, as we continue the story of the enslaved Israelites in Egypt, we're going to learn how God thinks about our hardships. When we last left our study in the book of Exodus a couple weeks ago before the holidays, we made it to the end of chapter 10 where God had brought mighty Egypt to its knees through a series of 9 plagues, with livestock and agriculture crippled, in some cases destroyed, and buildings crumbling from hailstones. This nation is suffering. It did make me think, why would God do something so horrible? Well, it's because we heard time and time again that Egyptian's king, this arrogant, prideful man who is called the Pharaoh, he would not release his slaves. The slaves were the people of Israel, God's people. And so now God has one final act, and it's going to be the most devastating of all. So we begin in chapter 11, and God tells Moses that in the aftermath of this final plague, Pharaoh will drive them out of the land. Now, God had previously said this was going to happen all the way back in chapter 6, verse 1. But for the longest time, it seemed like maybe God was wrong. No matter how progressively awful the plagues he sent upon Egypt became, the Pharaoh would not relent. It's like it wasn't working. So what could God come up with that would soften Pharaoh's hard heart? Or is Pharaoh too hard-hearted? Is this 10th plague going to be more of the same? I mean, remember the past few plagues? It kind of seemed like Pharaoh's heart was softening, and he would say something to Moses, okay, I'll let your people go. But then he changed. He relented, and he would not let the people go. So what is to stop this refusal from Pharaoh to just continue? Well, God doesn't think it's going to continue. Instead, God tells Moses to make sure the people are ready to leave. He even asks them to make a request of their Egyptian neighbors, which I think is mind-boggling. He says that the people of Israel are to ask their Egyptian neighbors to give them valuable items of gold and silver. Now, in our day, and maybe I'm affected by the fact that there are so many scammers out there that you and I are probably very hesitant about people asking for help, especially random people that we don't know. Well, is it realistic to think that the Egyptians are just going to give the Israelites their valuables? But also consider the cultural dynamic here. I mean, these are lowly enslaved Israelites in the minds of the Egyptians. And they're going to be asking their Egyptian captors for gold and silver. I mean, in any normal situation, the Egyptians would laugh. I mean, just scoff at this Israelite request. Like, are you serious? There's no way I'm going to give you my precious heirlooms and items. No. But this was not a normal situation. The narrator of the story tells us in verse 3 that God made the people of Egypt favorably disposed to the people of Israel. We also learn that the people of Egypt, including advisors to Pharaoh, held Moses in high esteem. So what could this detail mean? Well, hold that thought. We're going to find out specifically what it means next week. But for now, we continue the story, and we notice there is a scene change in verse 4. We don't actually find out what the scene change is until verse 8, but I'll tell you, it's that Moses goes and visits Pharaoh. And he reveals to Pharaoh what God has said about this 10th and final plague. It's awful. Every firstborn son in the land of Egypt will die. From the royal family to slaves, even farm animals. All firstborn will die. And God intentionally is driving to the heart of the people here. I mean, the firstborn is the heir of the family, the leader of the family. He's the one who carries the family name. He's symbolic of the family's identity and power. And this plague is going to cut that all out at the knees. Clearly, God is showing he is Lord of all. And so, Moses tells Pharaoh that through this plague, there is going to be a sound of mourning and wailing like they have never heard before and like they will never hear again. And I have to admit, as a firstborn, I don't like this one. Even if the plague of death wasn't targeting the firstborn, I struggle with it. I think, why, God? Why so devastating? Just because one man and his really hard heart? I mean, could there be no other way? And that's a tough one. I don't really have a good answer for that. I do have to admit, on the other hand, that God had given Pharaoh plenty of opportunity before this to allow the people of Israel to leave. In our culture, we have this famous saying, 3 strikes and you're out. God gave Pharaoh way more than 3. Some parents will count to 5 for their children to obey them. God counted to way more than 5. God, through Moses, had given Pharaoh 10 previous chances. You might say, wait a minute, Joel, there was only 9 previous plagues. We haven't gotten to the 10th one yet. But remember that before the topic of plagues even came up, Moses went to Pharaoh and asked him to let the people go. Then he had an additional 9 requests before each of the plagues. So there were 10 times. 10 refusals from Pharaoh. Well, gradually, as those plagues devastated Egypt, even Pharaoh's counselors advised him to let the people go and relent. Didn't work. Chance after chance after chance, nothing could soften Pharaoh's hard heart. And so we have seen God reaching out to Pharaoh. God only gradually getting to this point. We have seen God's grace and his mercy. But now it seems that a line has been crossed in Pharaoh's arrogance, and all firstborn will die. But what about Israel's firstborn? And God says that he will make a distinction between Israel and Egypt so that this plague of death will not affect Israel. And then Moses leaves Pharaoh. And the narrator tells us a very interesting detail. He said that as Moses leaves, he is hot with anger. I kind of wondered why. We don't know. We can only speculate. Obviously, Pharaoh was an absolute jerk, and so it could be that Moses is just angry about this. But remember, Moses was adopted into the Pharaoh's family when he was born. We think that this was probably his adopted brother, maybe adopted father. We're not totally sure. But think about it. Their relationship has come to this. Arrogant Pharaoh refusing to listen to his brother Moses. Sounds like some family drama, and maybe that's what has Moses hot. It's also possible that Moses is watching the devastation of Egypt. I mean, he grew up there. 40 years. He lived a charmed life as a royal prince of Egypt. He would have loved it, and it's being decimated. Another thought is this. Because of his adopted brother's stubborn pride, Moses' nephew is about to die. That's Pharaoh's firstborn. Someone Moses loves. And more than likely, Moses knows many other people who will be losing their loved ones and people who Moses also cares for. Why? Because Pharaoh is being stubborn. So of course, Moses is angry about this. At the end of chapter 11, the narrator gives us a quick summary of the previous 9 plagues and Pharaoh's hard heart and how it made no difference, and we jump then into chapter 12. How will the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, affect Israel? Well, the Lord tells Moses that the people are to make a religious holiday out of this. And he details how they will be saved from the plague. Each male head of household is to take a lamb or a goat, and they're to judge the size of the lamb based on the size of their family and also maybe some neighbors around them who might be in need of meat. And they are then to select a goat or a sheep without blemish, and they are to sacrifice it. But here's the critical instruction. They are to kill the animal at twilight and then spread some of the blood on the frames, the doorpost of the house, the sides and the top. Then they're to cook the meat and eat it with bitter herbs and unleavened bread, not leaving any leftovers, even burn leftovers if there are any. They're to wear traveling clothes as they eat. Clearly, they are to be ready to be on the move. Everything about this ceremony is a readiness to be on the move. And then God says that same night he will strike down all firstborn humans and animals in Egypt, except for the people who have placed the blood on the sides and the top of their doors. God gives them instructions for how they are to then celebrate this event as a religious festival for years to come. It's called Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Each year it will be a 7-day feast to help the people remember the 10th and final plague in Egypt and how God spared them. So Moses tells the people the word of the Lord, and he adds an interesting comment in verse 26. He's expecting children to ask, why? Why are we doing this? Children are often curious, so it's a good question, and the answer is even better. It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who will go over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt, and he will spare our homes when he struck down the Egyptians. We're going to talk about that because that is critical. How will Israel respond to this? Now remember that after the very first request that Moses made to Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go, Pharaoh reacted very poorly and he made life worse for the slaves. The Israelite foreman came back to Moses and bitterly complained about it was Moses' fault. He made it worse for them. So now what's going to happen? What if Pharaoh, in anger for losing his firstborn son, sends the military to come and destroy the Israelites? I wonder if any of the Israelites might have thought, this is bad news here. This is really bizarre. Some blood on our doorposts is not going to matter. Well, instead we learn that the people did exactly what the Lord told them to do. They bowed down. They worshiped him. And maybe there were some doubters. The narrator doesn't tell us. It just simply says they all obeyed. Now, perhaps that's partially due to the fact that they are very accustomed to sacrifices in their culture. It was an animistic culture that they lived in, and so sacrifices and blood was normal. And perhaps also they had watched God systematically, through the previous 9 plagues, destroy Egypt, spare Israel. It seemed that through those plagues, their faith in Yahweh was growing. He had done everything he said he would do. And he was clearly exceedingly more powerful than the Pharaoh. And so it makes sense that the Israelites would obey God. That's what they did. Now it was up to God. And once again, he did everything he promised he would do. He passed over every Israelite house, but throughout the rest of Egypt, every firstborn died. And there was loud wailing because every single house in Egypt experienced death that night. What we see in this famous story is God powerfully redeeming his people. The blood of the Lamb protects people from death. Does that sound familiar? We Christians read this story as pointing forward to the death of Jesus, dying on the cross, giving his blood and his body to redeem us. God is a God who redeems his people. And so no matter what you're going through, know that God has power to redeem it. He doesn't promise to make life easy. This was not an easy situation for the Israelites, and it was not going to get any easier for a long time. God doesn't promise us comfort or blessing or anything like that. And yet he is a powerful God who can redeem even our worst situations. And so take your difficult situation to him, cry out to him, pray for his redemption, and watch and listen what he will do. Follow his lead. Just as Israel cried out to God, worshiped and obeyed him. Watch for how God will work as you follow his lead in the midst of your pain. We have a redeeming God.